China and Japan have always had tensions, but what's happening right now is on a completely different level. On November 7th, Japan's new Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi announced that if China invades Taiwan, Japan will help Taiwan in fighting China. And she's not bluffing. Japan's been preparing to face China for years. I'll show you how later. But China's reaction was insane. A Chinese diplomat publicly threatened to cut off Takaichi's dirty neck, and Beijing even warned citizens not to visit Japan. Now as tensions explode, Japan is becoming the biggest threat to China's geopolitical ambitions. And the way China's reacting is not just out of anger, it's also fear. China's military even warned Japan it would face a crushing defeat if it intervened in Taiwan. So what is it about Japan that has China this rattled? Let's pull up a map of East Asia. See how Japan's islands sit right off China's coast? South of them, there's Taiwan and the Philippines. Together, they form what experts call the first island chain, a line of US allies. That's a massive problem for China, because if China wants to invade Taiwan, it needs to do more than just land its soldiers on the island. It needs to surround Taiwan completely, cut it off from allied reinforcements, stop supplies from getting through. That means Chinese warships need to reach the Pacific Ocean to set up a full blockade. But here's the problem. Every route to the Pacific goes through gaps between the first island chain, and Japan controls these islands north of Taiwan. These islands, especially Okinawa, are packed with air, naval, and missile bases. The US military operates from them too. If China attacks Taiwan, within minutes, those bases can launch strikes against Chinese warships, break their blockade, and fly in their own reinforcements. Japan being so close makes it almost impossible for China to isolate Taiwan. And here's how close we are talking. Japan's southernmost island, Yonaguni, sits just 110 kilometers from Taiwan. Now, China has always known that Japan would be a big problem. But for decades, China had one thing working in its favor that prevented Japan from being too big of a problem, and that's Japan's unique constitution. After Japan surrendered in World War II, the Allied powers wrote a new constitution for it, with a clause called Article 9. Article 9 did two things. First, it banned Japan from ever declaring war or using force to settle international disputes. Second, it said Japan can never maintain land, sea or air forces. Basically, it can't have a real military. To understand why Article 9 was so extreme, we have to understand that what Japan did during World War II when it invaded China were probably some of the worst atrocities in history. I know Japan has this harmless image of anime and being polite and so forth, but back then, Japan was brutal. There was the infamous Nanjing massacre where Japanese forces killed over 200,000 Chinese civilians and raped an estimated 80,000 women in just 6 weeks. Then there was Unit 731, a secret biological warfare program where Japanese scientists used Chinese prisoners for deadly experiments. In total, Japan's invasion of China killed between 15 to 20 million people. So Article 9 was a guarantee to make sure Japan could never do what they did again. But they found a way around the limitations of not having a military. In 1954, they founded the Japan Self-Defense Forces, not military forces as that's illegal under Article 9, but self-defense. The JSDF is now one of the world's most technologically advanced armed forces. Still, there was a limit. Under Article 9, Japan could only use force if they themselves were directly attacked. Self-defense meant defending Japan, not intervening in other countries' conflicts, like a Taiwan invasion. But then in 2014, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe changed the rules. He reinterpreted Article 9 and created a new legal concept called survival-threatening situations. Here's how it works. Japan can use military force if an attack on a close ally like the United States threatens Japan's own survival. It's not defending the ally because they are an ally, it's defending the ally because that attack puts Japan's existence at risk. That's the legal loophole. It's technically self-defense for Japan, and now Takaichi is applying this directly to Taiwan. Here's the logic. If China invades Taiwan, the US will almost certainly intervene. And when US forces engage China near Taiwan from the Japanese bases, the conflict threatens Japan's survival. Why? Because the Chinese blockade of Taiwan will cut off the sea lanes Japan depends on for virtually all its energy and trade imports. Almost all of Japan's oil, natural gas, and critical supplies pass directly through the waters south of Taiwan. A blockade would cripple Japan's economy. That makes it a survival-threatening situation. So under this framework, Japan can strike Chinese warships to break the blockade of Taiwan and defend US forces operating in the region. It's framed as Japanese self-defense, but the result is Japan and America fighting China together over Taiwan. But this legal loophole is only part of the problem for China because Japan has also been quietly arming itself. In 2022, Japan announced it would double defense spending to 1% of GDP by 2027, which will make it the world's third largest military spender. And here's what Japan is buying with their money. You have Tomahawk cruise missiles with a 1,000-mile range. That means Japan can strike Chinese naval bases and ports from Japanese territory, hitting the ships before they even leave for Taiwan. Then, a whopping 147 F-35 stealth fighter jets, the largest F-35 fleet outside the US. And they are fortifying the islands near Taiwan. Missiles on Yonaguni and Ishigaki Islands, radar stations that can track every Chinese ship movement. These islands are becoming forward operating bases that can strike Chinese forces the moment they move on Taiwan. China sees exactly what's happening. That's why they're threatening and intimidating Japan. But the problem is, as relations between the two countries continue to get worse, it's hard to see how either side can really back down because it's not just the geography or the weapons or the bad blood between them. What's trapping them in this escalation cycle is something both governments have been building for decades: nationalism. For the past 30 years, China has been running patriotic education campaigns with Japan at the center. Chinese history textbooks focus a lot on Japanese war crimes. Chinese state-sponsored war dramas show Japanese soldiers as brutal villains. Generation after generation of Chinese citizens have grown up learning that Japan is the enemy. Anti-Japanese hatred has become woven into Chinese nationalism. If you are a patriotic Chinese, you remember what Japan did and you don't forgive. The deep-seated hatred creates incidents such as the following. In 2012, Japan nationalized the Senkaku Islands. These were islands that were already under the control of Japan, but China claimed that these islands belonged to them. Chinese society took the incident really badly. Riots exploded across dozens of cities. Millions of people were protesting in the streets. They smashed Japanese cars, attacked Japanese stores. People were beaten just for driving Toyotas. Fast forward to 2024, Japan released into the ocean treated water from the Fukushima incident, which was a nuclear power plant disaster that happened in 2011 as a result of a massive earthquake and tsunami. Basically, the contaminated water from the power plant 13 years ago was treated to remove radioactive materials and then released into the ocean. The UN's International Atomic Energy Agency had inspected it and said it's safe. But then Chinese state media immediately jumped on the incident and said Japan was releasing nuclear contaminated water into the ocean. The Chinese government even banned Japanese seafood imports. Patriotic Chinese flooded Japanese businesses with harassment calls and even threw eggs at Japanese embassies. In fact, there was a guy who went to a shrine in Japan to urinate on it before spray painting the word toilet. And here's the thing. Beijing actively encourages this. Anti-Japan sentiment is a useful pressure tool. Boycotts on seafood, cars and tourism hurt Japan's economy directly and sent the message across. For example, after Takaichi's Taiwan statement, 500,000 flights to Japan were cancelled, all because Beijing told its citizens not to travel there. And there was a huge flare-up on Chinese social media. On Weibo, which is sort of like Chinese Twitter, there's a hashtag trending, 日本死气, which translates as Japan's dying energy. The narrative behind it, as explained by this popular nationalist blogger, is that Japan is like a zombie, a nation in complete economic and technological decline. They can't accept it's collapsing, so it's lashing out irrationally at China. And millions of Chinese people are engaging with this narrative, agreeing that Japan is a dying country making suicidal decisions. Here's a crazy number. 87.7% of Chinese people have a negative view of Japan. But it's not just them. Across the ocean, many Japanese people feel the same way about their East Asian neighbor. According to polls, 87% of Japanese have a negative view of China. A lot of voters actually support increasing defense spending and defending Taiwan against China. Takaichi knows this. Nicknamed Japan's Iron Lady, she's known to be an ultra-conservative nationalist, and she understands exactly what her voter base wants. When she says Japan will defend Taiwan, she's sending a message to voters, I will stand up to China. In fact, her approval rating jumped 5.5% after the announcement. In a sense, she's trapped. If she backs down, she looks weak. And it's the same with Xi Jinping. Both leaders are stuck in this escalation cycle. But Japan isn't just sitting there hoping things will work out. They're trying to make sure that if things escalate with China, their economy is not vulnerable to any Chinese moves. 1 week after Takaichi took office on 21st of October, she met with Trump. She gifted him a golf putter that belonged to her predecessor Shinzo Abe, who was Prime Minister from 2012 to 2020. It was a symbolic gesture as Abe was the architect of Japan's China strategy. As mentioned earlier, he was the one who reinterpreted Article 9 to allow Japan to defend allies. He also was the one who pushed for higher defense spending. He built the Quad with US, India, and Australia to counter China. He strengthened ties with Taiwan even though it pissed off Beijing. Basically, everything Japan is doing now to prepare for a potential conflict with China, Abe laid the groundwork. So when Takaichi gave Trump the putter, the message was clear. Her government is continuing what Abe started. And the two sides signed an agreement, amongst other things, on critical minerals and rare earths. Now let me explain why this matters. Rare earths are these special minerals that you need to make basically any electrical appliances. Your smartphone, electric cars, wind turbines, military weapons, all of them need rare earths. And here's the problem. China controls about 85% of the world's processing of these rare earths. Almost everything goes through China. So if China wants to put pressure on your country, they can just cut off your supply and your entire economy grinds to a halt. Japan learned the power of China's rare earths control the hard way in 2010. Basically, China and Japan had a dispute over the Senkaku Islands, where a Chinese fishing vessel collided with the Japanese Coast Guard. So China just stopped exporting rare earths to Japan. Within weeks, Japanese factories were shutting down because they couldn't get the materials they needed. This is economic warfare. And it worked. Japan had to back down, but they learned from it. After 2010, Japan spent a decade building their own independent supply, investing in Australian mines, building processing facilities, developing rare earths recycling technology. By now, Japan has cut its dependence on Chinese rare earths from about 90% down to under 60%, and they're still working to bring it down even further. So when the US worried about the same problem, Japan was an obvious partner. That's why now in the midst of the US-China trade war, they're helping the US build their own alternatives. The goal is simple: break China's monopoly, make it so that rare earths will not be entirely controlled by China. And it's not just rare earths. Since 2020, the Japanese government has been paying companies to move factories out of China, billions of dollars in subsidies. If you are making something critical like medical equipment, car parts or electronics, the government will pay you to move production somewhere else. And hundreds of Japanese companies have relocated, mostly to Vietnam, Thailand, and the Philippines. Japan's also building deeper trade partnerships with these countries, and also the likes of Australia and India. The strategy is to create supply chains with countries they can trust. Now, are these countries going to side with Japan and the US against China over Taiwan? Realistically, hell no. But what Japan is doing is making sure that if things go bad with China, their economy doesn't collapse overnight like it almost did in 2010. This is a long-term strategy. Japan has turned their geography into a choke point, reinterpreted their constitution. They're investing in their military, and now they're trying to reduce China's economic leverage. China spent decades preparing to confront the US, but the one that might stop their geopolitical ambitions might be Japan, the neighbor they've hated for generations, right there on their doorstep. With a new leadership eager to stand up to them, and this could stop their entire plan for reunifying with Taiwan. Now, China's plan for taking Taiwan isn't what most people think. I'll break down the most likely scenario and why it's already starting in this video right here.